Good evening. For 2 decades now, the Memorial Museum has been a participatory experience, teaching and instilling an understanding of the senselessness of violence. We are honored to do this online conversation as we commemorate the important milestone in the museum's history in keeping the conversation relevant. Because of the work of the Memorial Museum, what Oklahoma City went through more than 25 years ago will never be forgotten. We will use the lessons learned from those days in teaching the story to a new generation, and it is more relevant today than ever. Oklahoma City is a stark example of why there needs to be a federal domestic terrorism law. There was no domestic terrorism law in the United States Code as a criminal offense. So, following the Oklahoma City bombing, the deaths of the 8 federal law enforcement officers could be tried in federal court, but the 160 other deaths had to be tried in state court because the U.S. government had no jurisdiction for those lives, even though the federal building was the target. Now, more than 25 years later, our nation is still grappling with the same issue of domestic terrorism. Hundreds were arrested following the protests turned insurrection on the United States Capitol in January. And the discussion has started once again as to why isn't there a federal law that makes domestic terrorism a crime. Good evening. I'm Bob Ross, Chairman of the Oklahoma City National Memorial and Museum.
And I'm Carrie Watkins, Executive Director of the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Tonight we will continue that discussion. Where are we more than 25 years later after the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City? Have we made any progress on extremism and identifying homegrown terrorists?
Well, tonight we get an insider's perspective from former FBI Assistant Director Frank Figliuzzi, who was in charge of all counterintelligence, directing all espionage investigations across the U.S. government, frequently briefing the White House, Congress, and the Attorney General. He is one of our nation's leading experts on domestic terrorism. First, a special thank you, though, to our partners at the American Fidelity Foundation for underwriting tonight's online conversation. Frank, welcome to Oklahoma City.
Bob, it's my pleasure to be here. You and Carrie and the team have been especially kind, and I once again have been moved simply by being here and what this place means to all of us as Americans.
Thank you.
It is a privilege to be here with you. There's a solemnity and a sacredness to the memorial and museum that it shares with only a few other places. Places like the 9/11 Memorial, where terrorism was visited upon us, a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, and now, since January 6th, the U.S. Capitol building. The sacredness of this place comes, of course, from the lives lost here, their memories and their souls that live on for eternity. And the solemnity rises from the realization that for those of us who remain, the horror of what happened here, the gravity of how and why it happened, lies not only in our past, but in our present. And if we fail to heed the call to do something about it, it may likely take up residence in our future. I'm an invited guest here and honored to be so. Carrie Watkins and her team have been exceptionally kind. Invited guests, especially those invited to speak, often feel compelled to repay the kindness with what I call the 3 Ps: praise, platitudes, and pleasantries. And those things should be heaped upon the members and supporters of this memorial and museum. Because this place exists, Americans will never forget the tragedy here, nor the lives and memories of those who died. And because of the ongoing work of this team in education and outreach, we have become more informed, more aware, and more vigilant of what leads people to the kind of violence experienced here. Yet, there are other P's I've come to speak about tonight: power and purpose. Because of who you are and what you've experienced, the people of Oklahoma City have the kind of credibility that gives you power. The power to speak out unabashedly with the strength and conviction of people who have lived through pain and discomfort. And your experience imbues you with purpose, the kind of motivation toward bias toward action that comes when you never want to see something happen again. But here we are, again and again, seeing the ugly fruit of hate, of lies, of violence visited upon us, this time in an attack upon our democracy, so that in a way the Oklahoma City tragedy is not unique to this place, but has become an American tragedy. So as I talk about power and purpose, your invited guest tonight may make you a bit uncomfortable, but we are living in uncomfortable times. It's human nature to react to discomfort in a couple of ways. We can practice avoidance, pretending that things aren't that bad, they will simply get better, or that certain events are not connected, but isolated incidents. Or we can seek to confront discomfort and unpleasantness by acknowledging it for what it is and devising a strategy with our power and our purpose to do something about it. Let's start by acknowledging what happened at our Capitol on January 6th for what it is: domestic terrorism. Now, you may say, Frank, who gets to decide what is or isn't domestic terrorism? Well, we, the American people, already have. The definition of domestic terrorism is codified in the U.S. Code. It goes something like this: the use of force or violence to coerce or intimidate a government or civilian population for the purpose of advancing a political or social objective. Now, if what happened inside the Capitol on January 6th isn't domestic terror, I'm not sure what is. Yet, while we have a definition of domestic terrorism, here's the thing: we have no law against it. In fact, domestic terrorism is the only criminal program in the FBI that they can investigate you for, but never charge you with. That's because domestic terrorism is not illegal. Many people, in fact, people I respect, say that we have plenty of laws to use whenever domestic terrorism occurs, and we don't need another law. Certainly, Timothy McVeigh was arrested for serious crimes. Dylan Roof, a young white supremacist who murdered black members of Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, was arrested for serious crimes. But the crimes of people like McVeigh and Roof were so much more than the sum of just their individual violations. Because of what motivated them, because of their purpose, those were offenses against what we as a nation stand for, what defines us as American, as a democracy. Yet, the lack of a domestic terror law that acknowledges assaults on who we are is precisely why we are seeing the January 6th insurrectionists charged with things like trespass, assault, and theft. And while we're beginning to see the first charges for conspiracy, especially against members of the Proud Boys, and there is talk of possible RICO charges or even sedition charges, we still don't have consequence that would flow from a law that matches the gravity of the crime. A crime that assaulted the iconic symbol of our democracy and attempted to prevent the validation of a fair and democratically elected president. When someone's arrested for bank robbery, they aren't arrested for trespassing in the bank. They're arrested for the far more serious charge of bank robbery. It's a federal felony because the government insures that money. In a sense, a bank robber is robbing from the government. Yet on January 6th, people tried to rob us of our democracy. But we're arresting them, excuse me. Yet we're arresting them for trespass. For further evidence of the gap in our laws, you need only look at how we would have treated those insurrectionists if they were a different religion, with a slightly different objective. Let's make those rioters Muslim, and their objective, violent jihad. Now, we would see them charged with the far more serious charge of international terrorism. or material support to terrorism. For that, they would face 20 years to life in prison and even execution. It's time for the legal wall to come down between international and domestic terrorism, and for us to treat the internal threat as we treat the external threat. The FBI director, Chris Wray, has candidly testified before Congress that domestic terrorism is now the top priority threat in our nation. And more specifically, that hate-based groups, including white hate groups, are the top threat of violence within domestic terrorism. A couple of years ago, the head of counterterrorism for the FBI testified before Congress and learned, to his dismay, that some newer members of Congress were unaware that there were no federal laws against domestic terrorism. And the FBI Agents Association, representing the rank and file men and women of the Bureau, wrote an unprecedented letter to Congress stating that they lacked the tools needed to address this threat, and they called for a domestic terrorism law. We should listen when the people sworn to protect us say they need our help. There's a second area where the power you possess and the purpose that drives the memorial and museum can serve as a bully pulpit to make things safer. Unquestionably, the kind of radicalization that got us to mass insurrection on January 6 was incubated and hatched with the aid of social media. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Parler all served as echo chambers that amplified hateful rhetoric, helped like-minded violent extremists find each other, and even served as a planning and strategy forum for an insurrection. Importantly, these platforms allowed false and dangerous conspiracy theories to flourish and helped to mainstream the madness of the dangerous lies of groups like QAnon. These platforms are beginning to step up and take action. They are acknowledging their role in getting us to this point. They have suspended those who spread violence, hate, and lies. In the case of Parler, certain companies no longer provided the apps needed to exist. But those same companies tell us they simply cannot keep up. They cannot police themselves. The sheer volume of traffic is overwhelming. None other than Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook has stated he wants more regulation. We should take him up on that. Congress must regulate these platforms, not as media, but as a public utility. Violent hate speech and proven lies must be defined and applied across the industry so that terrorists can't forum shop for the most permissible platforms. And Congress should mandate reporting requirements to track and rate each platform's performance in addressing and identifying regulated content. If our government can track the safety and performance and near misses of each airline, we know they can find the social media platforms and rate them as to their safety and security. Your power and your purpose make you uniquely qualified to speak out in a meaningful way, a way that's most likely to be not only heard, but acted upon. In acting on these two issues, domestic terror legislation and social media regulation, your voices could become the voices of the victims of the Oklahoma City bombing, and you would honor and help shape their memory and our future. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Frank. That was terrific. Well, Frank, for our first question, let's consider this. We are more than 25 years past the Oklahoma City bombing. The violent ideologies, like the kind that led to the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building bombing, did not die with McVeigh. Where are we today, Frank?
So we've just explored the issue of a lack of domestic terror legislation on a federal level. And that's essentially a major gap in the law. But more importantly, Bob, the role of social media has essentially put radicalization on steroids. The speed with which you can hit the send button on a post, on a tweet, on a video is astronomically challenging for law enforcement and for the social media platforms. And we now live in these amplified echo chambers. We seem to get our news from only one source. We're not seeking truth in other sources of information. And so the sunshine never gets exposed to us. We don't see the light of day unless we're working hard on that. So my concern is, when you ask where we are today, still don't have a law that addresses this with the consequences that we need. Law enforcement telling us the tools aren't there. Social media playing a huge role in amplifying this. If you look at the about 200 people arrested so far in the insurrection, look at the charging documents prosecutors are using in their charges. In about 150 of them, you'll see references to their social media. Social media, we cannot escape the conclusion that social media played a huge role in getting us here, and they need to play a big role in getting us out. Until we do that, address the law, address social media, and come together through elected representatives to do it, we're not much better than we were 25 years ago. And I would assert we're even in more dangerous territory.
Frank, you mentioned this a little bit in your comments, but why is it that we don't go as hard on domestic terrorists as we seem to Islamic terrorists?
So there's an easy answer to that and convenient, and then there's a deeper one. So let me start with the easy one.
Okay.
We just addressed the easy one. It would be easy for me to sit here and say, well, Carrie, we aren't as hard on domestic terrorism because you know what? We don't have a domestic terrorism law. There's your answer. But there's a deeper question here. The question is, why is it that we seem so quick to see others as a threat, but not so quick to view ourselves as the threat? And when the FBI director has testified on the Hill that the top priority threat right now is domestic, we better begin acknowledging that our own people pose a huge insider threat, and we need to do something about it. But it's that concept of the other, Carrie, and it's the unwillingness to creatively see ourselves as potential threats that's really stopping us from addressing what's right in front of us.
What do you think it'll take to get that domestic terrorism law?
Well, a good question, and there's layers of question there, which is, what would a domestic terrorism law look like? What versions have been proposed in past years? There are proposed bills out there. One of the things that concerns me is that I want to be careful that we're not paying lip service to legislation. By that I mean, there are some bills that have been proposed that say, let's throw money at this. Let's give money to law enforcement to study the domestic terrorism threat. Let's give them some more resources. Let's ask for a study and a paper. I'm here to tell you that while no one's going to turn down money and bodies, law enforcement understands the problem. The FBI has been testifying about this problem for years. They know the problem. They need tools, not studies. They need law, not lip service. That's what concerns me about legislation. So what's it going to take? It's going to take a coming together and acknowledgement that something needs to be done. It's going to take us getting beyond all of the hurdles that get us to the law. Here are the hurdles that keep coming up. Well, Frank, you know, if we have a domestic terrorism law, I think you're talking about American government spying on Americans. No, I'm not. I'm saying we should have a law that allows the consequences to match the crime. What many people are talking about is, should we designate domestic terror groups as terrorism organizations? That concept we apply to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, should it ever apply domestically? I'm avoiding that issue. I'm saying that is deeply troubling, and we have lots of concerns about civil liberties, free speech, and privacy. But if we can simply agree on one thing, that currently the consequences don't match the severity of the crimes we're seeing, I think we can get there. But we're so highly partisan and politicized today, I fear we may not.
Gotcha. On the social media front, you talked about regulating social media. What does that look like 25 years from now when we reflect back about January 6th and what happened with Twitter and Facebook literally kicking the president of the United States off their platform?
I think
25 years from now, does history show that as a good move for America or a bad move?
You know, this memorial and museum is all about lessons of the past and applying them to the present. And I think we have some lessons to learn from working international terrorism. And by that I mean taking down and denying communications platforms for international terrorists was a blessing and a curse at the same time. There's a two-edged sword. First, you're playing whack-a-mole because they'll pop up a new site or chat room or blog as soon as you take one down, number one. Number two, the good part of taking down and denying a communications platform to folks that are violent or espousing hatred is that you seem to stop the spread of disinformation. There are academic studies right now that show that already the spread of disinformation has gone down with certain suspensions and denials of service. That's good news. The bad news is we're seeing a migration of extremism to encrypted platforms or dark corners of the web that law enforcement will find it even harder to find. And we know from our work in international terrorism that one of the ways you de-radicalize people is you expose them to truth and sunshine. So if you force them deeper and deeper down their rabbit holes, they never get exposed to sunshine. There are no guardrails for them. They can say and do whatever they like on their corner of the web, and we may never learn of it, and there's no corrective action that their family and their peers can take.
Interesting.
We'd love to get questions from our studio audience, our studio wall, and if you're on Facebook or YouTube or on our website, please type a question in the chat and we'll get those. If you're on the studio wall, please unmute your mic and ask a question. I'd love to take some questions from the studio wall. Anybody?
Okay, I'll be brief.
Thank you, Debbie.
The question I have is, you said that there are other people that have tried domestic terrorism kinds of regulations before. How recently have they been tried? Have they been tried, and what were they, and why didn't they happen?
A great question. So even fairly recently, we've seen legislation from both sides of the aisle. For example, former Senator from Arizona, Martha McSally, a Republican, proposed legislation to address domestic terrorism. The legislation language looked a whole lot like Democrat Congressman Adam Schiff from California had also proposed. So you would think this might have some traction. But by the time it got up through committees and into the larger Senate, it got shot down. And it got shot down for something we've already discussed, which is this fear that civil liberties and privacy concerns are going to fall, the whole concept of civil liberties are going to fall apart, that there's going to be abuses of domestic terrorism law, and that someday it will come back and haunt you personally, your group, your organization. And so here's what I say to that. I can never dismiss civil liberties and privacy concerns. They are real. They are not imagined. But we can craft a domestic terrorism law based on the already existing definition of domestic terrorism. It's based on violence, not ideology. We don't want to police what you think. We want to police the violent acts that come from what you're doing. And we want to treat attacks on our democracy, on what we represent, as attacks on all of us, and have consequences that match that crime.
Take a question from YouTube, from TY&B Travel. Is it easier to indict or prosecute a member of a larger domestic terrorist group than a lone wolf domestic terrorist?
So this is always an evidence-based situation. Prosecutors and agents like to have as much evidence as possible. So sometimes when a person is a member of a larger group or organization that stands for violence, it's easier to show how they got to their mindset, how they were trained and or funded. And so you could argue that that might make it much easier to prosecute. But in your question, there's language that I feel compelled to address, which is you're using terminology like a domestic terrorism organization. And I'm here to remind you, we have no such thing in the United States. We have no mechanism to designate a domestic terror organization, nor am I necessarily advocating that. We do for international terrorism. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Boko Haram, and dozens of other organizations have been designated. That makes it easier for law enforcement because now if you come into contact with those organizations, you communicate with those organizations, you come under intense scrutiny. And it's that kind of tool that's prevented a major act of international terrorism on U.S. soil since 9/11.
Gotcha.
Hi.
Yes.
Today, Judge Garland stated that we are facing a more dangerous period than we faced in 1995. Would you elaborate on that? How do you think that is so?
I would sadly I would have to agree with Merrick Garland. Look, we talked about the role of social media in getting us to where we are. That didn't exist. That kind of prevalence of Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and the need for that kind of affirmation and constant feedback from people you've never even met, that has amplified the radicalization process. Now add to that the extreme polarization we find ourselves in and this kind of demonization that occurs we're so quick to demonize and call evil people who simply disagree with us. Now, I understand where that may be coming from, but that is not helpful because the moment you demonize the other, it's so much easier to commit violence against them. You dehumanize them. And in fact, one of the things I think that the memorial and museum does so incredibly well is that they feature the victims. They humanize the victims of terrorism. That gets through to people. That resonates with people that these are human beings we're talking about. Whether you disagree about where they worked or what they chose to do for a living or even a political position, these are human beings. They're not demons. And so all of this demonization, polarization, social media, all contributes to a highly volatile environment, which is why I'm calling for some kind of legislation that helps us address it. But legislation isn't the single answer. Let's not be fooled there. This is a whole of society problem. Earlier today, we talked to educators about this issue. We need all segments of society, educators, business people, legislators, clergy, all of us working together to try and break down the walls that we've built ourselves.
Yeah, there's a question from YouTube. What elements do you think should be required under a federal domestic terrorism statute?
Great question. First, I'd be happy with almost any law at this point that addresses it, but I want to say this. Let's start with the easy stuff. Let's take the definition that we already have of domestic terrorism, the use of force or violence intended to intimidate or coerce a government or a segment of the civilian population for the purpose of promoting a political or social objective. Let's take that and say, if you do that, that's a federal violation. That's all I would advocate for right now. I think that would get us really far in terms of consequences that match the crime.
And Frank, what about social media regulations? What type of, are there common sense regulations that are out there being considered, or what does that look like? First,
I turn right to the social media CEOs themselves. I'm not making this stuff up myself. Let's listen to what they say. They say, you know what? We're really not media. Stop saying we're social media. We're kind of a public utility. We need to be regulated like that. We're not media. They want that regulation. They also say they want across-the-board industry standards so that one, say Facebook, one platform that's doing gangbusters on safety and security and is telling law enforcement when they see violence or exploitation of children, and another that's not doing anything, they say that's inherently unfair, and what's going to happen is the bad guys are going to gravitate to that more permissive platform. So they're asking for standardization across the board. A way to start there would simply to say, if what you're doing online violates a law, we've got a problem with that. Threatening to kill somebody, that's a problem. Let's start easy and see where that goes.
Well, that brings us to a question from Kelly Akins on our website. Can you talk about the intersects of free speech and hate speech? And she worries about that social media will hide behind free speech and will be less likely to incline to block speech that's hate, violent, and other conspiracy theories.
Yeah. Freedom of speech.
Yeah. So a valid and tough issue, which is why I am not advocating that we regulate speech as much as we regulate violence. So the moment you start getting into hate, the concept of hate speech, you have 1,000 definitions of what that could mean to different people, right? Are you just being mean to somebody? Are you attacking them for their DNA? This gets into extremely complicated, nuanced civil liberty, free speech issues that our society should probably not be headed to. That's why I'm saying, let's point to criminality. Let's talk about advocating violence, breaking the law. Let's start there. That we should be able to agree on. Today's a tough time to agree on just about anything.
Any other questions from the wall? This is great, sitting here seeing a few friends up there and a lot of guests, teachers from around the city, state, or even the country. Anyone from the wall? And Cord?
If you'll unmute.
You have to unmute, yeah.
So I don't know if this is an uninformed question, but I understand the importance of federal legislation. How important is it that states have legislation regarding domestic terrorism? And is there an example of good state legislation out there?
It's a good question. There are precious few states that address this issue of domestic terrorism in any meaningful way. And personally, I get concerned, just as we've just talked about platforms and not having industry standardization so that terrorists can seek out the more permissive platform. Imagine certain bad actors seeking out the state that doesn't address this kind of conduct and taking up residence there. There are actually other areas of white-collar law, by the way, where white-collar criminals decide to do business in a certain state because they don't think their crimes are going to be addressed there. I'd be concerned about that. I think the concept of domestic terror, if you think about it, is about addressing crimes against the nation, crimes against our democracy. I think that calls for a federal remedy more than a state remedy. I'll give you an area of the law that states are succeeding in despite the fact that there is no federal law, and that's the area of red flag laws. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that is a reaction to some of the school shootings, the horrific mass shootings, where we find that people actually complained previously about the shooter, that he was going to hurt somebody. And so states have started to enact what's called red flag laws that allows authorities to say, you know what, we've had enough complaints about you and violence. Until we figure this out, we're going to hold your weapons. There will be due process. You will have a hearing. We'll get to the bottom of this, and you may well get your weapons back. But right now, we are so concerned about the threat you pose that we need to hold your weapons for you. I know this gets into serious issues of Second Amendment. I understand that. But states are doing it very, very successfully. They can point to violence being stopped, suicides being stopped, because people temporarily have their weapons taken. And I'm saying we need a federal law that allows that to happen across the board. I know this is politically charged, and there's got to be due process behind this. But that's an example of something that states are doing because the feds aren't doing it.
There's a line in our mission statement, Frank, that talks about teaching the senselessness of violence, especially as a means of affecting government change. How do we teach that at the museum and our families, our friends? How do we teach that?
I think we need to recommit ourselves, particularly as educators. We need a recommitment to democracy, civility, and truth. The more you teach people that we have a system of laws, that we have a court system, that we have an election system that rises from local towns to counties to states to the Congress that ratifies an electoral college vote, the more we educate ourselves on the layers of checks and balances and court appeals that can occur, the more we'll realize by the time this gets through to the end, it's probably a legitimate election result. The more we educate ourselves on truth, the more we teach our children that violence is not the answer, there are other ways to get a grievance heard in our society, the more we commit ourselves to the core values of democracy, the rule of law, the Constitution, three equal branches of government, the less likely we are to see people go off of our system and try to seek out their own solutions.
So that fine line of protesting versus insurrection is where?
Wow, what a great question. First, the violation of law should be a bright line for people. We're all about, right? Our nation is built on protest, even rebellion. The question is, at what point are you undermining this very system that we represent? At what point are your actions so violative of the law that they violate every premise and tenet of what our democracy is? If you're attacking the very system that ratifies a vote for elected office, I would assert you're attacking our system. You're now committing an act of domestic terrorism. And so we need to remind ourselves that we're all conservators of our core values as a country. It's a team sport. It's not someone else's job to protect what matters most. It's our job.
And on January 6th, it was breaching the Capitol. That was the line that was crossed, the physical nature of that,
I think
versus being outside in the Capitol. I mean, is
you're
there...
raising a very interesting question that I predict we're going to see play out in courtrooms, because the 200 some odd people who've been arrested, those charges span the gap of mere trespass, right, into the building, and all the way to eventually we're going to find who murdered that Capitol police officer. But currently we have assault on federal officer charges. Okay. I want to say this after studying the crowd at the Capitol. The vast majority of that crowd, when you really study the videos, most of them couldn't even believe that they had gotten in. In many cases, I think you're going to hear a defense from some people saying, the barriers were moved. By the time I got there, I didn't have anybody resisting my entry. That's going to be an interesting discussion. Where I draw the line is when your purpose was to stop the process of Congress, to stop the Senate from ratifying a legitimate vote that's been proven to have been vetted and challenged through the court systems, and now it's resting with them to make that call. When you're messing with the system, when you're assaulting police officers, when you're assaulting a police officer while holding an American flag, there's something very wrong with what got us here. There's something very wrong with that conduct.
Back to the board, if anyone has a question, it is kind of hard to know, but you can raise your hand and then we know to call on you, so you can do that over the next few minutes if anyone does have a question. Polly Nichols, I thought you might have a question. You'll have to unmute and ask away. Polly Nichols.
I'm interested in, first of all, Frank, thank you so very much from the bottom of our hearts.
You're welcome.
For being here. And wonder what other groups or nonprofits have taken up this as a cause. What other groups, especially nonprofits, might we join with? And who have you been working with on this?
So that's an excellent question. And what I'm going to pledge to do is work with Carrie on identifying like-minded groups and organizations. I think an excellent partner, and I'm going to tell you right now, I've not gotten their permission to invoke their name, but the folks from the 9/11 tragedy, they've experienced international terrorism, and imagine the kind of partnership that could exist if they were to come alongside and say, the victims at Oklahoma City and the victims of 9/11 have at least one thing in common. They were the victims of terror and terrorism. And if you were to partner with that kind of organization, I think that would be helpful. Similarly, not directly on point, but the organizations that have sprung up after school shootings that talk about the need for additional security, that are well aware of the social media threat, for example, with our young people, might be like-minded people to partner with as well on this issue.
Great. Any other questions? I know, and keep them coming from
Hey,
our
Bob.
website. Yes?
Mike
Yeah.
Turpin.
Mike, is that Susan or Mike Turpin? That's Mike Turpin.
It's we're one and the same.
Oh, I hear Susan. Go ahead, Turpin family.
Thank you. This has been very informative. I wanted to make the point that Timothy McVeigh was essentially love your country but hate your government. And I like to say, Frank, he turned to, instead of the ballot box, the bullet box. So I don't think there's an easy answer to my question, but what do you think we do about hate speech, if anything?
Maybe there aren't any.
There's got to be a kind of guardrail that we're missing right now in our society that becomes self-corrective. By that I mean, if we don't do this amongst ourselves, starting with early childhood education, then our families, secondary education, clergy, business, etc., then we're on a slippery slope, because if we look to the government to control or regulate whatever hate speech is, I'm concerned that that could become an excuse or abusive or exploited by the wrong leadership. And boy, it doesn't take long to get wrong leadership occasionally. And so we've got to guard against that by doing it ourselves. And I know that sounds like a strange answer, but I'd love to see a society where we simply don't stomach or tolerate hatred. Hatred got us here. We've got to get ourselves out of here. I am not an advocate of regulating whatever hate speech is. I want to regulate conduct that results from that. So,
Right.
so for example, if let's say that you're a landlord and you say, I will never rent to people of a certain color. I don't like those people. That's speech. But the moment you actually act out on that, and you actually have opportunities to rent to people of a different skin color, you may now be violating the law because you're discriminating in fair housing or other civil rights violations. It's the difference between conduct and speech.
Right. Very helpful. Thank you.
Frank, there's a question we got, and I just want to paraphrase it. You heard it from a reporter earlier today when you met with the media of Black Lives Matter. Some people see them as a domestic terrorist group. So obviously, we don't see that. We don't appreciate. I mean, we go from peaceful protest to the violence. We struggle with that. But speak to why Black Lives Matter is not considered a domestic terrorist group.
Well, first, as we've said, we don't designate any group a domestic terror group because we can't. But the focus has to be on evidence-based findings. I look to the evidence presented by the FBI before Congress when the director of the FBI said, and incurred some real wrath on this, by the way, he said, I have to tell you, most of the violence is coming from the right and coming from hate-based white supremacists. That's the evidence-based case that law enforcement is making. Now, violence of any kind is never acceptable and must be denounced wherever it comes from. But the FBI has also said this with regard to Antifa, for example. He said, quote, Antifa is more of an ideology, unquote. It's not an organization that has a hierarchical structure. There's no home office in Peoria. There's no business card that says Antifa on it. It's an ideology, and it's caused people to come together. To the extent that that ideology causes them to commit violence, they must be denounced and arrested. And here's the interesting thing. I have a lot of people who come to me and say, Frank, you know, this domestic terrorism legislation, I see what you're saying, but boy, I think it could be abused and it's going to be exploited. And I say this, I come at it differently. The more we codify and get it right in writing and have a law to point to, the less likely we are to see political abuses for the sake of advancing a political cause. If law enforcement can point to a law and go, you just did that. I really don't care if you're green or purple, but you just did that. And so I think that prevents more abuse than it causes.
Great. Any other questions from the board? I know it's good to see Justice Taylor here tonight, and former Supreme Court Justice and trial judge over the McVeigh trial, and my immediate past chair here. So, Justice Taylor, it'd be good to hear anything from you or any others on the wall that have questions.
I will just say thank you to Frank for coming to Oklahoma City and honoring the mission that we have here in Oklahoma City and the mission of the Oklahoma City National Memorial Museum, because we're very proud of the part and the role we're playing to speak to these issues of violence, and we're seeing it more and more. In the law, we look for bright lines, and I think a lot of the questions and comments tonight have really demonstrated, it seems to me, the bright line is violence. The bright line is, for example, on January 6th, if those people had gone to the Capitol and stood outside the Capitol and waved their signs and yelled, or waved their signs and been silent, then all power to them. But the bright line is when there's people being hurt, buildings being burned. That seems to me the bright line. And the law looks for bright lines.
Indeed. Thank you, Justice, for your service to not only Oklahoma, but to our country. And I think the question then is whether there is an additional or brighter line that may come from the nature of the violence, meaning that if you study the purpose of that particular act, the objective behind it, and its impact on our system, whether it merits a higher degree of consequence because of what it is. And that's the question I think we need to have as a nation before this really gets way out in front of us.
Frank, we talked about tonight, we'd ask some uncomfortable questions, and there's one that was submitted on our website, and it talks about why, and our own police chief is on the board here, and we have a great partnership with the police department, but why do we see so much police presence at a Black Lives Matter rally and not as much at a Capitol protest?
Yeah.
I mean, how do we justify that to people of different skin color when they feel taken advantage of time and time again?
This is a difficult, the question's not as difficult as the answer. And so I think law enforcement professionals understand that their planning and their posture for an event needs to always be risk-based and intelligence-driven. That's how you defend your decisions. If you're a chief of police and you go to your city council and say, I need this much overtime, and they say, why? What's the threat and the risk? You need to defend your decision with data. Some of the presence on the streets of America this summer was validly defensible because there was a level of violence and vandalism and arson and property damage that merited it. And some did not merit that presence. And some of the presence was before some of the violence and vandalism occurred, simply because it looked like people of color were protesting. And so we have to ask ourselves some really hard questions when you compare and contrast that response, even talk of military troops on the ground, boots on the ground, right? Which is a real concern and for any democracy. And contrast that posture with what we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. Intelligence was there? You bet. People have said, well, January 6th was an intelligence failure. I don't call it an intelligence failure. It was a failure to act upon available intelligence. I was sitting at home for 2 weeks prior, watching extremist chat rooms, private and public. And we saw it developing. We saw talk of, quote, overwhelming the Capitol Police. We saw planning of travel and buses of bad actors on how they were going to get to D.C. The FBI said they shared intelligence reports with the Capitol Police. The Capitol Police Intelligence Unit said they prepared a very troubling report for their commanders. We have to ask ourselves the hard question. Are we capable of seeing ourselves, particularly of the same skin color, as a threat, even when the intelligence says you're going to have a problem? I'm afraid the answer is perhaps not.
And we heard a reporter talk about how he was attacked by readers asking that on how he referred to things, and we saw a little bit of that in our response when we came out publicly. If you didn't attack Black Lives Matter, we do condemn all violence, and I think that's where you're going tonight. Is it doesn't matter. It just we cannot tolerate violence.
We can't tolerate violence, and I'll go a couple of steps further. Much of the violence we saw this summer was the hijacking of peaceful protests by criminal element. There were people who simply wanted to smash windows. And if you pulled them aside and said, why are you smashing this window? They probably wouldn't tell you why. They couldn't explain it to themselves. Why are you vandalizing and taking merchandise from this store? Because I'd like that merchandise. Okay, that's not legitimate protest. That's the hijacking of a legitimate protest, and that has to be renounced as well. The question I think we all have to ponder is there a different kind of violence that calls for a different kind of remedy when the violence attacks our system, our democracy, and what we stand for? 25 years after the Oklahoma City bombing, we seem to still struggle with that question.
Mike Turpin?
Yeah. I know we're running out of time, and I joined late. You may have talked about this, but would you talk about what we could expect from Attorney General Merrick Garland, and what your impressions are? Do you know him? Are you friends? But what do you think he will mean to us and mean to America with his leadership as United States Attorney General?
Mike, that's a great question, and no, we hadn't touched on it, but certainly a hot topic in the news on every newspaper and in those articles, his
Indeed.
reflection of being here in Oklahoma City.
Yeah, indeed. So short answer to the question, I don't know the judge personally. I don't know Merrick Garland personally. I do know this: he is widely respected in both the law enforcement and the legal society writ large, the community writ large. I know this, that his experience on the ground here has informed who he is and how he looks at the crime problem, the threat, and the world, and how he understands what we must protect as a nation. Mm-hmm. I know that he has been scoured and scrubbed in the vetting process as it gets more and more arduous with any nominee in today's setting. And I know they're having a very hard time finding anything that they can hang a hat on that would derail him.
Yeah.
I'm sure that perhaps our political partisanship will cause some to posture, but I'm looking forward to an attorney general who understands the problem and the threat, who understands the dangers to our civil liberties if we do the wrong thing, and who will speak out for those who have historically have little voice in the justice system.
Well, Frank, on that front, that's a good segue. Tell us about your book and what led you to write it.
Well, you're very kind to ask about the book. It's been out about 4 weeks now. It's already a national bestseller, a bit to my surprise. In fact, if someone had told me, Frank, we're going to release your book in the middle of a national crisis, there'll be an insurrection, there'll be a challenged election outcome, and you're good luck with the book trying to find some traction with that, I would have said, this is terrible. And it's turned out that there are applications in the book to what our country is experiencing right now. Here's the book in a nutshell, and we'll move on. But the book's called The FBI Way, Inside the Bureau's Code of Excellence. I wrote it because I spent 25 years inside an organization that I know operates at a very high degree of excellence when the pressure is on, when the stakes are the highest. And I think there's lessons to learn from any organization that operates at that stress level and does so with excellence. It's not a book about the FBI being perfect. It's not. It's a book about the FBI getting it right most of the time, and more importantly, how you can do that in your own classroom, your career, your community, and now even our country by simply preserving what matters most. Some of my career inside the FBI was spent in internal affairs. That meant that I was tasked with protecting the core values of the organization. I take those lessons about preserving core values, I've turned them into what I call the 7 C's. You can apply them to your own journey and take away some things that I think come from the finest law enforcement agency in the world.
Great. Look forward to reading that.
Thank
and hopefully everyone does the same.
Thank you.
So there are many questions tonight we didn't get to, and we'll take time offline to answer those and get back to you as we wrap up tonight.
Yeah.
I think one of the things we want to just say is thank you, Frank, for being with us and for joining us and sharing your insight. Thank you to the American Fidelity Foundation, our friends there who have underwritten tonight. We're most grateful. Ever since April 19th, 1995, the world has looked to us as the standard and the blueprint in community response after a tragedy. We have also stand as a voice against domestic terrorism. Through this teaching of the museum and our exhibits, our online education programs, our ongoing discussions, and on this sacred ground, we continue to find common ground. You can join us by visiting the Memorial Museum or taking part in our signature program, Better Conversation. There's one scheduled for tomorrow night that John Kennedy will lead, and they're every Tuesday night from 7 to 8 p.m. on Zoom. You register at memorialmuseum.com. The museum is open for business, where we practice time ticketing and social distancing, and we require a mask. If you have not already found the energy and the strength to come, we hope you'll be inspired by your experience tonight and come join us. Bob?
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And Frank, it was a pleasure being with you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, guys.